Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Torah portion. And this week we are doing the Torah portion called Tzav, and it means given order. And we started with Leviticus last week, and as we all know, Leviticus is the book where the Jews start teaching their kids. The first book in the Torah that they start teaching their kids is Leviticus. And we start off Leviticus by learning about the sacrifices and how they work and how to bring the different types of sacrifices. And this week is a continuation of that. So this week we're going to be looking at the sacrifices. We are in Leviticus 6 verses 1. If you use a complete Jewish Bible or a Bible that's more Hebrew centered, but if you're in a normal English Bible, you will start from chapter 6 verse 8 and all the way through until we finish chapter 8 for Leviticus. And then I also put in the Haftorah portion and any sections out of the New Testament that you would want to read. So this week I thought I might be doing things a bit more different. I am going to try and do something that's a bit more practical. And like I said, chapter 6 to 8 deals with sacrifices and how do you bring these different types of sacrifices. And then the end of chapter 8, we start dealing with the inauguration of the priests and some of the prescriptions that God gave for them to follow. Okay, so I did this last year when I did the teaching. I did Leviticus 1 to chapter 6, and I thought I wanted to keep it in for this year's teaching. So just to quickly recap that we get 5 different types of offerings. We get the burnt, the grain, the peace, the sin, and the guilt offerings. And the first 3 are voluntary offerings, meaning only if you want to bring them, you bring them. And then the sin offering is for table fellowship as well as the guilt offering. So common misconceptions about offerings or sacrifices is that because they're voluntary, I think we grew up with a perception that, first of all, you have to bring them to get forgiveness for your sin. And it actually has little to do with sin. It has to do with the inner condition of your heart. And this is just a physical way of manifesting something that is deeply personal to you and between you and God. It pictures us and Messiah. You can always see yourself as a sacrifice, but you can also see Messiah being a sacrifice. And we all have, at some point, have to die to ourselves, our own will, our own needs, our own desires, in order for us to really connect to God. And this pictures that. It also pictures Yeshua's death, and that he gave us the ultimate sacrifice, but also that sacrifices will not be obsolete. Sacrifices will resume when Yeshua returns. And Jews have never believed that sacrifices remove your sin. So in order for you to get forgiveness for your sin, you have to first bring the sacrifice. They do, however, believe that people need to give themselves to God like a sacrifice does. Sin and guilt offerings is a way of expressing regret for unwillful sin. It's sort of, if I'm thinking about a husband and a wife, if the husband maybe messes up a bit, he'll bring the wife flowers. The flowers doesn't really matter. It's the fact that he says he's sorry and he shows it with his actions. There's no sacrifice for willful sin. If we think of King David, he fell on his face before God and he just repented. That is the way it's always been believed by the Jews. They believe that they've been saved by grace through faith. And Jews have always taught this. Okay, so common practices with sacrifices is the first thing is that sacrifices are washed, the hands and the feet. The innards are sacrificed, but the hides, the skins were used for another purpose, and we'll get to that a bit later. The sacrifices are used to draw close to God spiritually. It's something we manifest in the physical that connects us to God in a spiritual way. And this is actually something that we're going to be looking at today a bit. Okay, so Grant calls it the elevator to God, Grant Luton. Okay, so it is for fellowship with God and people, because they sat around a table and they ate the sacrifices. Okay, and then again, the first three are voluntary. The Torah does not teach human sacrifice. There was no such thing as humans ever being sacrificed, but it does teach us, like Yeshua did, to sacrifice ourselves, our needs, our time for other people. But the most important thing that I want us to look at today with sacrifices is a physical action that presents a spiritual connection. Doing something in the physical that gains us insight into the spiritual. Okay, I want us to see that the sacrifices also it can represent so many things. It can represent me in the physical, connecting to God in the spiritual. It can represent another person. It can represent Yeshua. It can represent something in the physical. There is a physical component to this, and there are physical rules that needs to be followed. It has so many spiritual connections. I think we can keep ourselves busy for an eternity if we just look at all the spiritual connections. It also represents community. Like I said, after sacrifice was brought, there was a table set and people would eat, and the Levites would eat. So we see there is a sense of community. There's also community in the Levites serving the people. And we also see that the temple, the people lived around the temple or the tabernacle. And so there was a sense of togetherness. There was a sense of community. There was a sense of fellowship. And the sacrifices teach us how to live together in that fellowship and in that community. It also represents relationship. It can be a relationship between, if you sin, we sin against God, but often we also sin against people. And our hearts towards people, if we unwillfully sin, what does your heart look like? And what does that relationship, how do you correct it? How does that look like? And also towards God. And then you need to, the priests all work together to serve in the tabernacle. So we see there's also relationship there. And then lastly, connection, I think, is the most holistic way of you can see this as me connected to you, connected to God, connected to the priests connected together, and they all connected to God. So we see the whole image of the sacrificial system is connection. And I think sometimes we get so overwhelmed by how the sacrifices were to be handled or brought and how to deal with the rules of it. We forget that it's the connection that really matters. So if you look at the sacrifices, I read through last week and this week's portion, and I mean, there is a lot of things to remember. And I understand why the priests had to study so long, because you really had to have a good memory of, well, this is this type of sacrifice, and this is how we bring it, and this needs to be splashed here or waved there, or this needs to be sacrificed, or the whole thing needs to be sacrificed. Then I need to do this, and then I need to take this to there. There's a lot of rules. It's quite complicated. And I asked myself, why? I've been reading through these portions for years now, and I still don't have all of these things memorized. I don't think I'll ever have them all memorized. I'll have to constantly go back and reference and look up. And why did God make it so complicated? Was there a way to make it less complicated? And of course he can, he's God. So then we need to ask ourselves, why the complication? Why make it so layered and complex? And it's almost rich, why did God do that? And I think the simple answer for that is that because the sacrifices is a representation of relationship and connection in community, it represents our relationship with God. And I don't think anyone can say that my relationship is 100% the same as the person next to them, or can say that it's 100% uncomplicated. Our relationship with God is complicated, and there is a reason for that. The reason for the complication in our relationship with God is because sin entered into our lives in the garden, and our relationship with God was shattered. We see that there was an absolute physical connection to God. Adam and Eve could see God, they could easily speak to God, and there was a oneness with God. And with sin, we see that there's something in that relationship that got disconnected, and we're no longer able to walk with God in a garden. Of course, you can. I'm speaking now in the literal sense, like Adam and Eve did, but excuse me, the connection between the physical and the spiritual was shattered. We see that there's a disconnect in every person that happens where we have these physical needs, but we are these spiritual beings, and these two are constantly opposing one another. These two are constantly having a battle in the physical and in the spiritual for power. And so we see where there was once harmony between the physical and the spiritual, that harmony has been shattered. And now if we think of the sacrificial system, now we're doing sacrifices in the physical that has this highly spiritual representation. And so the sacrificial system is the place for it in the Torah. What does it teach us? It teaches us, it pictures for us, how do we reconnect the physical, which is us, back to the spiritual, which is God. If you think of everything in the sacrificial system, the rules that are kept, the sacrifices that are brought, the things that are placed in the tabernacle, how they place, all of this is a representation that God made for us in the physical that is actually something spiritual. And so the reason we study the tabernacle, we study the sacrificial system, we study the sacrifices, and why it is still so valuable, even though there is no temple for us today to bring sacrifices, what it represents is still a connection for us to God. Okay, so what if sin never entered the equation in our lives? What if there was no sin? Okay, people would get along, people would be whole, people would be able to dwell with God and other people in total and complete peace. There would be no pain and suffering. But sin did enter. So now what? And I know I'm taking a bit of an unconventional way of teaching about sacrifices. I hope you'll just stay with me. When sin entered, the first thing we see is that there was death and separation. Even though it wasn't immediate death for Adam and Eve, we do see that death was set in place, and God separated them. God made a separation between the garden where he could dwell and visit with Adam and Eve. He said, I'm going to separate you from the garden, and I'm also stepping back. Okay, the separation that took place caused a disconnection between what is physical and what is spiritual inside of us, and we became a broken people inside. And if we just think of the way people started dealing with one another after sin, I think the first example we can look at is Cain and Abel. And ever since then, we see there's strife between people. But you can also see, I think if you can look at anyone, you can see the brokenness and the hurt and the wounds behind their actions. And that brokenness and that hurt and that woundedness comes from what sin did in us. It made us a broken people inside because there was separation, there was death, and that's emotional pain. And my mother always said that hurt people hurt people. and we see that over and over again, how sin, selfishness, makes people hurt other people, or defensiveness, or lies. If you just think of the betrayal that Yeshua experienced, how other people and their needs, their sin, how it causes hurt in the world, how it causes more brokenness. But if we do and act like Yeshua in those situations, we can bring healing. And that's what I want to talk about today. So, with the capacity to break those around us, right? So, the separation brought a disconnection between the physical and the spiritual. And we became a broken people who now not only have the capacity to hurt ourselves, but also to hurt those or break those around us. So we have all been broken by sin and what sin has done in our lives. I don't know a person alive who I can say this person is 100% whole. They never react out of any wounds or hurt. They don't have any defenses. They never rude. I just don't know such a person. And this is the consequences of sin, is brokenness. Sin we commit against ourselves, sin we commit against others, all of these things, it contributes to the brokenness inside us. So my question was, how do we heal a brokenness inside us by looking at how sacrifices are done? Because that's the purpose. The purpose of the sacrificial system was your heart. What does your heart look like? How does your heart react? And even Yeshua says, and we'll look at the scripture later, where he talks about the most important thing, the most important commandment is to love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself. So we see relationship and community and coming together in love. That is the most important commandments. And not empty sacrifices, not just doing the sacrifices because they have to be done. We need to learn something more out of it. And my question for today was, how can we learn to heal our brokenness by looking at what happens in the tabernacle and what happens during sacrifices? So the first thing is, and this is where the complicated story comes from in the beginning of this teaching, is there simply is no easy recipe for this. We see if we look at the sacrificial system, it's hard to memorize. The rules are vastly different for different types of sacrifices, though we see there are some rules that are just non-negotiable. We see that there is no such thing as just quickly do this and that, and your brokenness is completely gone. If we look at the sacrificial, there's no just quickly doing this and quickly doing that and the sacrifice is done. It takes effort, it takes time, it takes someone with knowledge serving in that area to maybe help and guide you. It takes so many things. It is complicated to heal the brokenness inside so that the physical and the spiritual can come back together. And the reason we want the physical and the spiritual to come back together is in those moments that we are truly a human being, which is our creation. We are created to be human beings. And it's only when the physical and the spiritual come together and the physical can submit under the spiritual, but there needs to be a connection for that to happen. Okay, so that is pictured by the sacrificial system God put in place for connecting heaven and earth. If you think of, I especially think of the smoke going up from the altar and the altar of incense. It speaks about that smoke, being a sweet fragrance in God's nostrils. And it speaks about how there will be fellowship between God and the people who bring the sacrifices. And so we see that the sacrificial system and the temple is a place where God says, I'm in heaven and you're here on earth, but what you're doing in the physical, the intent of your heart that goes with that, can bring these two things in connection with each other, sort of what Jacob saw on the ladder, right, is this connection. So how do we heal brokenness through the sacrifices? Okay, so I thought I'm going to do a very holistic view of things that we find in the sacrifices. So sometimes, every different type of brokenness you have inside of you, every different type of sin or action or reaction, it will require something different. Sometimes it required a loaf, sometimes a bird, sometimes a goat, sometimes just pieces of the animal. Sometimes you had to burn the whole thing. Sometimes it was determined by capacity. If the person didn't have enough money, there were substitutes that they could bring. They didn't have to always just bring a sheep or a goat. There were substitutes that God provides for the financial capacity that people had. So we also see God has an understanding for your capacity to heal certain wounds or to what you can bring to the table. And He's okay with that. He just wants you to bring the sacrifice and come to the table and fellowship with Him. Other times, it is something very specific that is required. I think specifically about the feasts. There were specific things required for those sacrifices, specific ways they did it, and those were the set rules. And so we see sometimes to heal other type of wounds, it has nothing to do with your capacity. There might just be, this is the only way you heal that wound. That's the only way you heal that brokenness. And you just need to follow through with the steps and have faith that that the sacrifice that you bring, God will hear the sacrifice and there will be a connection. But the whole point of bringing the sacrifice was connection of that which has been shattered by sin. Okay, and that's I often ask myself in the past, when they speak about your heart and God doesn't want empty sacrifices, and sometimes it's so abstract. You're trying to take this thing because the people living in the desert, they at least had a temple or a tabernacle to go to where they could physically sacrifice. So there was something for them physical to do and then make the connections and bring it to a spiritual place. But because we don't have that, we don't have a place where we can go and walk this out physically and get that deeper meaning and connection and feel it in our hearts, it sometimes becomes abstract. And so for me, and what I got from reading last week and this week's portion was to say, okay, how do I get my heart involved in the sacrificial system? How do I heal my brokenness through that? How do I connect with God? And how does that heal the shatteredness inside of not only me, but also the community that God has placed around me? Okay, so again, connecting that which has been shattered is complicated, but it is not impossible. Yes, the sacrificial system is complicated, but these sacrifices were made and they were made perfectly because someone put in the effort and the time to study and work on themselves and make sure they have everything under control that they need under control and memorize so they could do the sacrifices and do them right. Okay, so I listed a few things that we see when we read through this chapter. I am sure that you can find many, many, many more things that are involved in the tabernacle and in the sacrificial system. I'm sure that you can make your own connections. So please, you are so welcome to pause and go through everything that I wrote down and maybe make your own connections, get yourself involved in this process of thinking about how the sacrifices connect to a brokenness in people and how that can be healed. So this is just the list of things that I quickly wrote down for this week's portion. And we're going to look at them each individually. So I think the first thing we can honestly say about brokenness, and we're going to talk about passing through the fire a bit later. But the first thing about being a broken person, or having a wound, or having just a disconnect. I have so many clients who I see that will say, there is, I don't feel God, or when I pray, I feel like God doesn't hear me, or I feel like I'm not connecting with God. I feel like there's distance between me and God. So even if it is just, if that is your only brokenness, there's no other wounds, we're looking at things that will help us to reconnect to God through this portion. Okay, so the first thing is we all go through difficult times. We all go through times of stress. And that, for me, in this week's portion is represented by the burning or passing through the fire. Now, the fire was in a couple of places, right? It was on the altar outside, it was by the table of incense, and also the menorah has fire involved. If you think about baking the breads, you know, there's fire involved in that as well. So we see that fire is almost everywhere in the tabernacle, and it doesn't matter how well your intentions are and how much you love God. This is a requirement for us as a faith community to pass through the fire. So I just wrote down the first things that sort of popped into my head when I looked at all of these words. So the first thing that I thought, there's a purification, especially if you think of the gold and the silver. There's a purification that takes place when we pass through the fire. We cannot sit and think, God, I've been through enough now, please let it stop. You know, sometimes God passes us through that fire again and again to get rid of the impurities inside of us until our heart is at a place where our heart is pure, our heart is connected to God, and getting rid of the things that taint us. And that might be sin, or it might be wounds. Often if we don't heal our wounds and we don't allow those wounds to heal, then out of those wounds, we hurt other people. Our thoughts and our beliefs about ourselves and about other people, we need to get purification. Our biggest battle, I believe, except for against the enemy, is the battle in our minds. I think if we can purify our minds and we can purify our emotions from sin, then a lot of healing would take place for us. Then the next thing in this portion that I thought about was that things were placed on the altar. And I always, when I think about placing things on the altar, you know, my brain always goes, but I'm the sacrifice. And then I think about Isaac and how willing he was to get onto the altar and be that sacrifice. And I think that's the heart that we all must have. But a lot of people, I've also heard it, they will say, well, I sacrificed that to God. And we must just be careful. Sacrifices to God are things that are clean only. Only clean things can go on the altar. I do also think that, I don't know, for me and for a lot of people I know, placing yourself on the altar is saying, I'm removing my hand from certain situations and I'm giving up control to God. I'm going to stop trying to control the outcome of this. I'm going to stop trying to control where God wants to take me. I'm going to stop trying to control people in my life or whatever it is. I'm giving up the control to God. And this for me is a big test of faith and trust that we place in God, because it is, we often believe in God and we believe God is real and we believe in his word. But when it comes to trusting God with our needs and our income and our children, it's very difficult sometimes. We don't want to give up that control, because what if God does something I don't like, you know, and that's part of life. And so if you want your disconnections inside of you with people and with God to heal, the best thing to do is to let go and let God, and place yourself and your relationships on the altar to be sacrificed to him. And I promise you, God will never lead you astray. The next thing is that things got washed. Some of the sacrifices got washed. So sometimes we see that even though something that we bring to the altar, though it is considered a clean thing to bring to the altar, it was still washed. Some parts of it was still washed. So even if your intentions are pure, even if your heart is, in the right place, sometimes what you do, it comes from a place of brokenness, or maybe it's tainted a bit by sin. So we need to wash that away. But we also see that they had to wash themselves and wash their hands before they entered certain places. And we see that if you think about washing their hands, obviously, whatever they deal with in the sacrifices, they wash that off. But sometimes we also wash our hands from things that we make ourselves. If you think of just normal bacteria that grows on the hand, especially if it's sweaty during the day or something like that. So sometimes we need to come to the temple, and part of our sacrificial system is washing away things that no longer involves us, or something that's behind us, forgiveness. You wash yourself of the situation. But other times, the thing that you need to wash away comes from inside of you. If you think of the burning that we spoke about, the impurities that the fire brings out of you, there's nothing like being in conflict with someone and then seeing, maybe I am wrong, and maybe I'm the problem here, and maybe it's not what I thought it was, and maybe I need to look inside of myself. What have I created inside of myself that has been pushed out, sort of like sweat out of the body? Sorry, I know this is a bit gross, but that needs to be washed off and cleaned off for me to connect to God and to connect to other people. We also see, especially when it comes to our identity, it needs to be washed of any ego. It needs to be cleansed of what we want other people to think about us. There's no healing if there's not truth. And there's no truth if you live out of your ego. You can only truly connect to yourself and to God and to other people out of a place of identity. So we also need to wash away all the things that's festered inside of us, that reaches the outside of the body, and we need to get rid of it, and we need to get rid of the masks and the things, and just be real. Now, being real doesn't mean we need to be rude, but real. The next thing is the priests had very specific garments that they had to wear. And the physical thing was, first of all, it was to cover them. They were covered up. But we also see garments as a protection. Garments shows a place of rank. The high priest had a different garment and a different get-up than the rest of the priests. And we also see it also is a barrier between me and the outside world. And so what this represented for me, a lot of times in our brokenness, we reveal things that shouldn't be revealed. We expose things that shouldn't be exposed. Specifically, I thought about criticism. We sometimes are very easy to criticize other people. Instead, we should be looking at ourselves. So that was one of the things that I think sometimes we should not uncover someone's nakedness. We shouldn't uncover them with our criticism and our words. Now, there's a difference if you have real relationship with someone and they come for advice and they ask you to speak truthfully. The other thing is to protect. Clothes bring a protection, and protection is such a valuable thing, because if you protect yourself against sin, against things that will taint you, if you protect someone else, then we see there is a safe space that is created. And that is a big part of healing our brokenness, is saying this is a safe space for you. So protection. And then the hold rank, I think, is also quite physical. And then the barrier, we'll get to barriers a bit later. Okay, then the making of the bread. I want you to think about, I hope what I'm trying to do here is making sense to all of you. The making of the bread, we first see that the grain needs to be crushed, right? So in our brokenness, some things in us needs to be ground down and needs to be sort of worn until it is a floury form. There are some things in us that God comes and he crushes. But what he does is he adds other things, and then he starts kneading a bit on us, but that kneading on us, and it forms us into something. And then on top of that, again, the fire is added, the heat is added, and we see that this grain turns into something absolutely amazing, and it tastes amazing. There's nothing like the fresh smell of bread, if you walk past a bakery. And so we see that in our brokenness, we sometimes get so scared of getting hurt and wounded and crushed again by the healing process. And through the fire and through the making of the bread, and we'll see some other examples later as well, there's no other way to get you to a place of connection and healing other than breaking you a bit more. And heat is added, and so sometimes for us to connect to God and to connect to people, to connect back to ourselves, to get rid of the sin in our life, things first have to get very, very bad, to a point where we feel like we cannot get up from this, sort of a break point. But God says, don't worry, I will not leave you in that raw state. I'm going to add ingredients, and then I'm going to knead you, I'm going to mold you, I'm going to shape you. And then I'm going to add some more heat. Just when you think, oh, I can breathe, then God says, no, wait, a bit more heat. And then he adds more heat, and then something beautiful and fragrant comes out of that. And not only that, Yeshua says, I'm the bread of life. So we see being made into a bread, being crushed and kneaded and burnt, can feed the masses. Okay, so it's not a nice experience always, but it is something that's totally and completely worth it. I also thought about, when I was doing this specific bullet point, I thought, when women are pregnant, sometimes we say you have a bun in the oven. And I thought that is absolutely such a good example, because I know so many people with kids who tell me no one will show you where you need to work on yourself more than your own children. They bring the crushing, and they bring the kneading, and they bring the heat to get that extra bit out of you. And your life is absolutely sacrificed for those kids. Okay, then the next one is spices. The spices that we find in the for the altar of incense is also crushed and burnt. But we see it brings a sweet aroma, just like things that are placed on the altar and burned. We see there's a fragrance that is connected to those crushing and burning, and we'll get to that a bit later as well. We see blood. Sometimes there's some blood sprinkled in places, and the first thing I thought, of course, is life is in the blood, and Yeshua paid a price for us. And the price was his life. His blood was shed for us. And that was not a cheap price. And I should have added this maybe to the next slide, but this is actually the crux of it. Yeshua said, I am going to look at this sacrificial system, and I am going to do and cover all of it, because you can see Yeshua in every single one of the offerings that's brought. And so he said, I'm going to give up my life. I'm going to bleed for you. And it's going to save all of these people. And if you want your sacrifice, if you want your life to mean something, This is the only way it will really mean something. This is the only way you can be like Yeshua, is following in his footsteps of living a life of sacrifice, but also doing the things that are done in the temple with the right heart. Do it for love and with respect and joy, because that's absolutely what he did. He lived life to the fullest. Okay, then serving God, we see the priests serve in the temple. I'm going to go through the second list, I think, a bit quicker. We see that serving others and serving God, this is something that the priests did. There is no sacrifice without servants who are willing to do the job day in and day out without complaint. They didn't get anything out of it. You know, they weren't filthy rich people who lived the good life and had hundreds of workers working for them and had the nicest car and all of these things. They were servants. And so we see there's no healing our brokenness without serving others. We need to serve people. Grant Luton always says your life will only have meaning to the extent that you lay it down for others. And this is what we need to do. We need to lay our lives down for others and for God. And through that, we get healing. We get connection to God. We get connection to people. And we get rid of sin in our lives, because people will call you out on your sin. If you have good relationships, you know, that brokenness that sin brings into your life can be removed. Then the creation of the smoke, we talked about this a bit earlier. Also, it's the sweet fragrance. And the thing that I thought is like smoke lingers. If you light a candle that has maybe an aroma to it, you know, when you blow out the candle, hours later, there's a smell that lingers. And if you want to know how disconnected you are with yourself and God and other people, ask yourself, what lingers when I leave? Do people feel exhausted? Do people feel drained? Do people feel attacked? Do people feel criticized? Or do I leave them feeling whole, feeling better, feeling love, feeling the heart of God when I leave? Okay, the sacrifices obviously has to die. So we see there is some death, and death is not a bad thing. It represents separation, and not all separation brings brokenness. There was separation brought through sin, but not all separation is bad. We see in creation that God separated the heavens and the earth and the water from the ground. So we see separation is good. We sometimes, if we are broken, it's okay to take a time of separation or to step back. It's also okay to say, I'm going to make separation between me and this type of person. You know, that is okay to do. We see that there are curtains, okay? That's all around the tabernacle, and those are boundaries and limitations on us and on other people. So we see it's okay to have boundaries and limitations. Just because you are a servant and you are serving other people, it doesn't mean you're not allowed to have some boundaries and limitations. The curtains, I think, also represents, you know, not everyone could just go anywhere. So there are rules to follow, and certain boundaries and limitations that, you know, they in a marriage, there are two people and God. That's a boundary and that's a limitation. You don't allow other people into that space. And so we see oftentimes we wound ourselves and we make our brokenness and our disconnection worse by involving things or people in places where they don't belong. The skins of the animals were used to write the Torah on. There's no healing. Obviously, the Leviticus is part of the Torah, and what I'm trying to teach is how this specific section heals brokenness that was caused by sin, and there's no doing that without having the Torah written on you. Okay, and then things had to be clean. Clean often refers to the food, and it's also, again, describes gold, that purification that takes place. And then I just want to end off, the last thing in this Torah portion is Aaron and his sons, who had to had to sort of be sequestered for 7 days, and they couldn't have any, connection with anyone. And that just quickly for me connects with creation. And that's where we're trying to get back to. We're trying to get back to the Garden of Eden, and so I just wanted to, this is how you walk it out. You walk back to the Garden of Eden by serving others, by making sure you bring a sweet fragrance, by sacrificing some things, by other things you put a boundary up, by other things you follow the rules, other times you have to separate. Whatever it is, your brokenness can be, if you really go and study this Torah portion, the sin in your life, or maybe the life of your forefathers that has brought pain into your life and wounds into your life, that brokenness can be healed by looking at what the sacrifices represent, and taking that to heart and saying, I'm going to choose to separate. This is where I need to separate. This is where I need to join with community. Here is where I need purification through fire, but here I need some crushing and some kneading. So this is a complicated thing. And I think sometimes we try to think I just need to do one of these things and it's going to fix all of my problems. And it's going to connect me back to God, and it's going to connect me back to people, but it doesn't. We sometimes need to do all of these things to get ourselves back to the garden, back to a place before there was sin, so that we can connect with God and we can have the fruit of the tree of life and just have that eternity with God. And then the last thing is, there was eating, and there's no eating alone. That's nice. So that definitely involves fellowship. There needs to be relationship between you and people. First of all, we cannot see our own brokenness and the effect it sometimes has on our relationships if there is no relationship. So we need relationships that are safe, where we can hear, where we need to work on ourselves, but also feel safe to say, I need to stand up for myself. Okay, so the temple stands ready for all of us to come where there is a need for us. When you have a need, when you feel broken, when you feel wounded, when you feel disconnected from God, when you feel lonely, the temple stands ready. And God says, come, I'm waiting for you to bring a sweet fragrance. Come, I'm waiting for you to serve. Come, I'm waiting for you. There might be some brokenness and needing and burning, but I'll make something delicious out of that for you. And we see sometimes it is required. We need to show up for the appointed times. We need to show up and bring those sacrifices. And taking off of work, my relationship with God is important for me. I need that connection. Okay, so the temple stands ready so we can heal the separation and the brokenness inside of us and live in a community where God dwells in our midst. That was the whole point of the tabernacle. It was built around a community. The sacrifices were done around, in the midst of a community, and God said, I'll come and dwell there with you. And so if we allow ourselves to become all these parts of the tabernacle and of the sacrificial system, that's God's open door invitation to come and dwell in our midst, and we get that healing and we get that connection that we want. We cannot always heal others, right? You cannot come and bring sacrifices for everyone. Yes, there are sacrifices that cover people's sins that were done on behalf of the wider group of Israel. But the choice to come to the temple, to bring your sacrifice, to show up for the fellowship, to come sit by the table and enjoy the meal that happens because of the sacrifice, that choice is yours. Now, you can choose to go, but your heart is rotten, and there will be no connection. There will be no healing. There will be no joy. But if you come to the table and I'm going to be a bit broken, and I'm going to be a bit burnt and crushed, and separated for a while, but when I come to the table with joy, and I went through those trials and those tribulations with joy, then that is when the healing happens. That is when there's a reconnection between the physical and the spiritual. Okay, I want to tell you a story about a rabbi. This rabbi, this was just before the Holocaust. The rabbi would walk through the town, and everywhere he went, he would always greet everyone. He was well known for it. And then the Holocaust happened, and he was placed into a concentration camp, and they were lined up one morning, and there was a guy with a stick at the end of the line, and he would say to the left and to the right and to the left and to the right, and everyone he sent to the left, those people were sentenced to death, and everyone to the right would live the day. And so he'd say to the left and to the right and to the left and to the right, and the rabbi was waiting in line, and when he got to the front, he just looked up into this guy's eyes, who's now going to tell him execution or you're living, and he said to him, "Good morning." And the guy smiled and said, "To the right." And he survived the Holocaust, and years later he was telling the story, and he said that is the power of a kind heart who just says good morning. And when I heard this story, I just thought so much about what we're talking about today, because being a sacrifice is not easy. Giving up things is not easy. Being broken and struggling to get to God and get to people and get to wholeness is not easy. But your heart, being kind in your heart, seeing everyone around you as a human being, seeing everyone as someone of value and someone worthy of you saying kindly every time you see them every day, "Good morning." It has the power to save a life. And that's what this rabbi said. I want to talk a bit more about the fire and why the fire is so important. Like I said, we see the fire a couple of times. We see it when the making of the bread on the altar, the incense, and we also see it with the menorah. And so we see the fire is essential to sacrifices. There are no sacrifices without a fire. So when God says you need to be a living sacrifice, there's no way of doing that without the fire. So we see the fire is essential for healing our brokenness and bringing us back to connection between the physical and the spiritual, between community, in relationships, and between us and God. The fire will always reveal who you are at your core. If you are truthful, I think that's something we should put in brackets. If you are truthful, not to other people, to yourself first. It's the most difficult to be honest with yourself. So we see that being happy, even during the Holocaust in a concentration camp, which is, I think, the worst trial and tribulation you have to go through, or the Jews had to go through, that rabbi was happy, and it saved his life. He could find joy in the middle of the fire. Being miserable and negative will never heal the brokenness caused by sin. Being upset, being bitter, thinking, why does this always happen to me? Why am I in this situation again? Why does God never answer my prayers? These thoughts, what they reveal about you is that your focus is not God. Your focus is me. And we cannot be a sacrifice if we focus on me, and we cannot bring a connection between me and God if the focus is on me. Yes, we as believers need to pass through the tabernacle, through the fire, but we need to do it with joy. That's what God talks about with regards to your heart. We connect the physical to the spiritual by making a choice to show up with joy and not add to our brokenness caused by sin. Because if you don't show up with joy and happiness and being excited to be the sacrifice, being keen to be the sacrifice, you're going to cause more brokenness and hurt and pain for yourself. We instead need to follow the instructions of God on how to be a sacrifice and how to be a sacrifice among other people in different situations. When we make ourselves living sacrifices, we need to understand our God is a consuming fire. It is the very essence of who he is. So we cannot escape the fire that will purify us, the fire that will bake the bread, the fire that will bring the sweet aroma and fragrance out of the meat and out of the spices, the fire that burns inside of us to be a light like the menorah. Forget what you can lose as a sacrifice. Don't think, but I'm already so broken. I'm already so wounded. I cannot lose anymore. Don't think about what you can lose when you pass through the fire, because when you pass through the fire, it burns up things, right? It gets rid of the impurities in the gold and silver. Meat shrinks in the fire. The wick in the fire burns away. The spices are burnt up. The bread also shrinks, maybe if you have leaven in it, it will grow a bit, but we see that the fire tends to chip away and make us lose things. And if the fire can burn something up, it was never worth keeping. So don't be scared of losing it. It will not heal your brokenness. It will not bring you closer to God. It will not connect the physical connection to the spiritual connection. The fire will reveal the quality of who you are. It reveals the silver and the gold underneath and within the impurities. It toasts the spices and the meat to a sweet aroma. So it will reveal the essence. And I found myself often in a situation where I haven't dealt with my brokenness, and then I get myself into a situation where there's fire, and what comes out of me is absolutely horrid. And the fire revealed the quality of me, and I might have been a coward or defensive or rude or just everything that the Torah tells us not to be. And that reveals something for me to say, okay, there's a wound here, or there's a brokenness here, and it's because of this I feel lonely, or I cannot connect to God, or I cannot do this. And so we must be glad for what is revealed. The fire will also reduce, like I said earlier, what comes out of the fire is always precious. So you might lose some things along the way, but what comes out of it is absolute gold and pure and precious. And whatever endures the fire, that is real. That is your identity. The ego cannot stand through the fire. Your glass house cannot stand through the fire. Your perceptions and your face masks cannot stand through the fire. Your identity and your identity in God is the only thing that remains. And that's why we must bring ourselves and all of our sacrifices with the heart that's looking towards God and God's will and God's word. Because if it's not, nothing will endure, because only that which is real, and God is the only real thing we really have. So whatever doesn't make it through the fire, that was never you. Okay, and it was never God. So it's better to get rid of it. It was just an illusion. So when you go through a tough time, you cannot hide. When life gets hard, that is when we follow the pattern of the tabernacle and the sacrifices. We go through the fire, we make the sweet aroma, we wash ourselves from what is not good, and we put up our boundaries, we serve, we choose life, we choose fellowship, and we choose to serve. That is how we heal the brokenness brought by sin, because that is exactly what Yeshua did. Okay, so I just want us to look at, we didn't look at a lot of scripture. Please go and read through this week's Torah portion. I hope you've already done so before you've listened to the teaching. But I want to look at Mark, and it says, I can't remember where in Mark this is, I'm sorry. One of the Torah teachers came up and heard them engage in this discussion. Seeing that Yeshua answered them well, he asked them, which is the most important commandment of them all? And Yeshua answered, the most important is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you are to love Adonai your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your understanding and with all your strength. The second is this, you are to love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. The Torah teacher said to him, well said, Rabbi, you speak the truth when you say that he is one, and there is no other besides him, and that loving him with all one's heart, understanding and strength, and loving one's neighbor as oneself mean more than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices. When Yeshua saw that he responded sensibly, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And after that, no one dared put to him another question. So I think this was what set off my whole reason of thinking for this teaching, is the burnt offerings and the sacrifices are so important. But it needs to be done with a heart, knowing that God is one, he's the only one, and that we should love him with everything in us. And we should love our neighbor as ourselves. And everything that we see in the burnt offerings and in the sacrificial system and how they're done are small teachings for us on how to see God as one, how to love God with everything we have, and how to love our neighbors as ourselves. And if we take those two things, we bring them together inside of us. We have a connection. We're working with a connection to God and a connection to his community. Then our burnt offerings and our sacrifices will never be empty. And they will bring us, because Yeshua said, he responded sensibly, you are not far from the kingdom of heaven. And that's what we want. We want back in the Garden of Eden. If we take these two things, God and our neighbor, and our hearts in the right place, our burnt offerings and our sacrifices bring us to a place where we are not far from the kingdom of heaven. And that's the person. So how can we bring sacrifices today? I exhort you, therefore, brothers, in view, sacrifice living and set apart for God. This will please him. It is the logical temple worship for you. In other words, do not let yourselves be conformed to the standards of this world. Instead, keep letting yourselves be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you will know what God wants and will agree that what he wants is good, satisfying, and able to succeed. So we are a living sacrifice by keeping our eyes on God. Okay, so the purpose for me and what I got out of this week's teaching with the sacrifices is it's for healing for a broken kingdom, and it starts with you. You need to make a choice to show up. You need to choose what the condition of your heart will be. You need to choose to do it with joy. You need to choose to pass through the fire and praise God while you are going through that fire. You need to choose to be like that rabbi and be kind and be happy, and still find humanity inside yourself for someone like a guard in a concentration camp. We need to search for goodness and love, enduring your sacrifice with joy and happiness, choosing to put in the complicated effort to heal yourself, having fellowship with people who loves God. And this is what it means to live a life like Yeshua, to live a life of sacrifice. Choosing to do something in the physical has a spiritual effect. Whatever you do in the physical will reveal the real you in God. Shabbat Shalom. I hope you have a lovely day.